I think he just showed me the page, and it was just like tick, 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 like pretty much every one of the symptoms I kind of showed. And that was lucky in a way. It sounds like bipolar disorder will be this thing that's so easy to diagnose. It sounds like just kind of crazy, happy to suicidal depression. It must be really easy to diagnose. The literature basically shows that the average delay between first symptoms and diagnosis is about 8 years. So often, and that's because the diagnosis is maybe incorrect, but also because people don't walk into a psychologist's office or psychiatrist's office and report the positive or the elevated stuff very often. So it takes somebody who's skilled and a good psychologist should always be able to ask and look into some of the elevated stuff. But often when a person's depressed, they can't even really recall feeling good. It's so foreign to them at the time that they are unable to kind of communicate it. So that diagnosis can be quite difficult. Yeah, so after I was diagnosed, I started looking into the disorder quite a lot. I started paying a lot of attention to how it was portrayed on TV and that kind of thing. You just start noticing whenever a character is like, okay, is that what I've got? And I noticed that there was a lot of misrepresentation of the disorder and a lot of simplistic explanations. And I kind of realized, well, this is obviously what the public sort of thinks about it, because this is where they're probably getting their information from. So from 2003 to 2013, I carried on working. Fortunately, I hated my job so much that I was like, I need a change. I really enjoyed looking into psychology. I found it really fascinating. And I went back to university in 2013 to study. So I went to UKZN. I did, it was kind of like a conversion course, like a non-degree purposes course. Because I had another degree, they let me do my undergrad in 1 year. So all Psych 1, 2, and 3 I did in 2013, my honours in 2014, my masters in 2015. So I did research psychology. So I'm not a clinician. I just want to make that kind of clear. And then I did my PhD afterwards. And again, with relation to productivity, I completed a 500-page PhD in about 8 months, submitted it, done. And we'll speak about some of the benefits of mania as well. So, well, not necessarily mania, but of hypermania, because it can be very problematic as well. Okay, any questions before we get into this? Anything? Okay, nothing so far. All right, so I put this presentation together in 2018. It was basically designed for people who are supporting people with bipolar disorder. So I think, you know, if a person's got a decent psychiatrist, which is not always a given, and a decent psychologist, again, not always a given, those are two elements, but one of the major areas that I always felt was kind of lacking was the social support. So that interaction with family and with friends, and it wasn't because family and friends were not wanting to provide support, but just because they didn't really understand what I was kind of going through. And you know, my dad would like read a book and try to kind of get his head around it, but that wouldn't necessarily explain things very clearly. So I put the presentation together to have those conversations with people that were supporting loved ones and wanted to maybe understand their behavior and understand maybe what they could do. And I kind of positioned it like that, but then I think a lot of the people that they were supporting were maybe not that happy about the fact that I said, well, this is what they should be doing as well, because I think that that's a really important thing as well. What should the people that have been diagnosed be doing? And there's a lot of responsibility for them as well. It's not just a case of, you know, I've got this diagnosis, you need to support me through anything. Whatever goes wrong, you need to just be there for me. There's a responsibility on both sides, and I think that that's an important thing to kind of understand. Okay, so I've kind of said if you can answer the following questions, you should be able to better provide support. So what is bipolar disorder? It used to be known as manic depression, sometimes manic depressive illness, sometimes bipolar mood disorder, sometimes bipolar depression. I like bipolar disorder, that's the term that I'll use. How is it diagnosed? And like, why is it important to understand the diagnostic process, both for family members and for the person in question? I think that's really important. The third thing is, what is mood and what does it have to do with the symptoms? And that's where I'm going to hopefully communicate some of the things that I don't think are communicated that well in the literature. So what is mood? How does it affect us? How does it affect the way that we see ourselves in the world in the future and that kind of thing? What causes it, both initially and then new episodes, and understanding particularly what causes new episodes allows you to take steps to prevent those new episodes from happening, or at least minimize the chances of them happening again. And then what is the best way to manage the disorder and to assist loved ones? Right, so firstly, yes?
Sorry, just in terms of genetics, so is it something that if say for example, parents have, could it be passed down to
yes.
Okay.
So it's probably the most genetic of the sort of major disorders that you see in the DSM. So if you, and in terms of genetic, like basically what I'm talking about is the degree to which it's passed down from family members. And the way that they work out whether something is genetic or not is often through twin studies. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, I've got this person who's an identical twin, and because they're an identical twin, the genes in their identical twin are pretty much exactly the same. So if this person's got bipolar disorder or depression or whatever it happens to be, what are the chances that this person does? And it's about between 40 and 70%. Okay, so that's pretty high, but it's not 100%, which I think is a very important thing to keep in mind, which means that it's not just genes. It's not like Huntington's disease. If you've got the gene, you get the disease. So genes are playing a major role in, and they can obviously compare, because that doesn't really tell you too much on its own. It's kind of like saying, well, if this twin's got feet, then does this one also have feet? Well, everyone's got feet, so that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a genetic thing that's contributing. But like, for example, major depressive disorder, it's between like 20 and 40%. If this identical twin's got it, then this one's going to have it. And they can also compare identical twins to fraternal twins, to siblings, to just random members of the population. And the closer they are in terms of genetics, the greater the chances are overall that there's going to be that concordance. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's kind of how they know that genes play a really big role in bipolar disorder, more so than, well, it's more likely to be inherited in bipolar disorder than in other disorders. And even on that point, between 10 and 17% of the population will experience major depression at some point. With bipolar disorder, it's 1 to 2%. So even the fact that maybe 40% of people with major depression, there's going to be that concordance. There's a higher chance that the average person is going to have depression as well. So, I don't know if that makes any sense. Okay, so it's often presented like this. So this is just a picture off the internet, one of the first ones I found. A condition characterized by periods of depression and mania. True, but highly simplistic. Okay, so it's a far more complicated illness. So bipolar disorder, often referred to as bipolar mood disorder or bipolar affective disorder. So it affects mood. That's primarily what it affects. And those of you that have studied psychology or are psychologists, you'll know that there's this interaction between mood and thinking and behavior. With some disorders, the primary thing that's being sort of impacted tends to be, for example, cognition or thinking, and then that's going to affect behavior and maybe mood as a result. With bipolar disorder, it seems to be that mood is the primary thing that's being impacted, and then that's going to affect thinking and behavior as a result. But those things are always going to be interacting. Schizophrenia, for example, you kind of see some of the same sorts of things. So you can see these periods of hallucinations or delusions or psychosis, but the mood element is less pronounced in schizophrenia, whereas in bipolar disorder it seems to be a heavy mood episode that might be related to these periods of hallucinations, delusions, that kind of thing. Okay, so there are periods of hypomania or mania. Have you all heard the term hypomania before? Okay, so just be cautious with that. Often people say, well, that person wasn't just manic, they were hypomanic. And, so they get the word hyper and hypo confused with each other. Hypo meaning below, so hypomanic basically means below manic. Manic being the highest that you can basically go. Hypomanic meaning above the normal range of mood, but not quite in that extreme sort of state. There are periods of depression, so very low mood, low energy, guilt, problems with concentration, eating, sleeping, those kinds of things, suicidal ideation, those kinds of things in depression. So very much the same as the symptoms of major depressive disorder is the bottom end of bipolar disorder. Yep. So is the question. And then you've kind of got the opposite on the other side, which is mania. Important to note that there's often long periods of normal mood in between. So whenever you kind of hear about bipolar disorder, you often just hear about people, it sounds like people just bouncing up and down. That happens very rarely. Generally it's these longer periods of being up, these longer periods of being down, and then often longer periods of what's referred to as euthymia, which is kind of normal mood. And with treatment and medication, those periods can be extended quite a lot. Okay. All right, so there are these change in moods. These moods impact perception or thinking. So when your moods are elevated, it presents you with a lens through which you see everything. So like rose-colored spectacles is quite like it doesn't really capture it enough, but when your mood is elevated, everything just seems to be better. Everything just seems to be wonderful, and that can lead to bad decisions. Is that decision a good decision? It may have seemed 50-50 before. Now it seems like 90% that's a great idea to do it. And we'll get onto the how irrational all of us are in terms of how we make decisions. So I think that's something that it's quite difficult for people to identify with, because they kind of say, well, that logically was not a correct decision to make, or logically that person's life is not as bad as what they are feeling it is when they're depressed, or logically, etc., etc. But our minds don't work like that. Our minds are, most of the decisions that we're making, most of the things that we're thinking are intuitive, and we're trying to make sense of a very complicated world, and we're not carefully thinking about all these things. So when our moods are kind of normal, then all those decisions and whatever, and thoughts about ourselves and the future and the world are kind of normal. But if our mood and our intuition moves out of normal, then our thinking and our behavior and our decision making can also become problematic. Okay. All right, so some general information about the illness. About 1% of people are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and it depends on how it's defined. So it can be defined in a number of different ways, and we'll kind of get to that breakdown. In terms of men versus women, it's pretty much 50-50. We'll speak about bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 2, there tends to be a slightly higher proportion of women. Bipolar 1, there tends to be a slightly higher proportion of men, but overall, it's more or less the same. The age of onset, there have been diagnoses of children. There's actually quite a difficulty in distinguishing ADHD from bipolar disorder in young people. A lot of the symptoms seem quite similar. But generally, it's going to present late teens to sort of mid-20s. That's when the most common time that the disorder is going to be diagnosed. Once or recurrence, it tends to be something that's chronic, that carries on for life. So if the diagnosis is correct, and generally it shouldn't be made based on a single episode, although sometimes it is something that tends to repeat itself and kind of keep going over a period of time, particularly if it's not medicated and dealt with. Comorbid conditions? Yeah, so.
I just wanted to find out, is it something with epigenetics? Can you trigger, can bipolar be triggered by something in the environment? Or
yeah, so that's certainly what the evidence looks like. So the fact that identical twins, it's not 100% concordance between them, shows that environment does definitely play a role. So environment does definitely play a role, and there are a bunch of things that you can do to definitely make episodes more likely. Whether or not you would be able to avoid it forever if you... I mean, life also happens. There are very few people who live sheltered enough lives to never go through that event that may be the initial trigger. But there certainly are things that can make it more likely that additional episodes will occur. So yeah, drugs, alcohol, like not sleeping properly, like major stress, those are all things that can contribute. Even antidepressant medication can be a big problem, which is why the diagnosis has to be done correctly. So anxiety disorders is often going to be comorbid. We know that with mood disorders in general, so with depression we see about 40 to 50, I think that's 40 to 50% of people with major depressive disorder also are experiencing some form of anxiety disorder. You're seeing the same thing with bipolar disorder. Substance use disorders, alcoholism, drug abuse, that kind of thing. 50% of people, more or less, with bipolar 2 have got a comorbid substance abuse condition. Up to about 60% of people with bipolar 1 have got comorbid substance abuse conditions. I'm going to get onto some of the biology of bipolar disorder. One of the major theories involves the reward pathway, which is heavily involved in addiction. So that same pathway that is driving behavior, driving the need to go and do things with bipolar disorder can be focused on things like various substances. And it seems that may play a role in the high comorbidity between the two. So we've spoken about borderline personality disorder a little bit. Just the fact that that's not necessarily a comorbid condition, but one that's often confused with bipolar disorder, and then ADHD in children can be confused. Schizophrenia, there's a lot of similar symptoms as well, particularly on the psychosis side of things. So bipolar disorder, particularly on the manic side, you can start seeing delusions and hallucinations, which are kind of the core positive symptoms of, I say positive symptoms, I mean the symptoms that are the person's doing something more in schizophrenia, not that they're awesome. And you see that in schizophrenia, you see it in bipolar disorder. As I said earlier, with bipolar disorder, those sorts of symptoms tend to be aligned with a major mood episode. So, and often they're mood congruent, which basically means that if a person is manic and feeling really good, then their delusion will be a grandiose delusion. It will be a delusion about them being amazing or fantastic or wonderful and being able to do something incredible. Whereas with schizophrenia, it tends to be that the psychosis is not necessarily mood congruent. So the person's mood could be okay, and they might have a persecutory delusion or a paranoid delusion or something like that. So there's those slight differences, but also other symptoms in schizophrenia. Okay, any questions?
I have a question, but I think it's more brain physiology, so I'll ask you
Okay.
when we ask it now. Because it's also not a comorbid, but I read lots of literature that says, because you're talking also about schizophrenia as well, that schizophrenia, bipolar, and autism have similar kind of brain physiology.
Well, yeah, so, and I mean, I've kind of looked at a sort of Venn diagram of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and ADHD, actually, so not autism, not ASD. And there's definitely a lot of overlap between the genes that are involved. And it seems like schizophrenia is kind of the bigger one, and then within there, there's bipolar disorder and ADHD. But I know that there's definitely, for a long time, they've noted similarities in terms of some of the genes that seem to be involved in bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But they, so far as I know, they haven't worked it out yet. And it also seems like it can be this bunch of genes or this bunch of genes or some combination. And sometimes people refer to it as the bipolar disorders rather than bipolar disorder. Yeah. Okay, so how is it diagnosed? Well, I'm just looking at the time. This is so important. And the reason that I say that it's so important is that there are massive consequences to either being diagnosed or to not being diagnosed. So if you do have the disorder and you're not diagnosed, then it's chaos. Because then you are untreated bipolar, you are having episodes far more regularly than you would normally have them. That's a major problem. You also don't want to be diagnosed incorrectly, because now you've got all these things that you've got to do, and it's going to change your life in quite a nasty way. So consequences of diagnosis, medication, we'll get onto medication. Absolutely essential in the treatment. I'm not a big lover of medication, but I take it every morning and I take it every night, and all the literature says you can't manage this just with natural processes. You can make things a little bit more stable and you can improve your situation, but medication is really important, and there are side effects and they're not fun, and it can take you a long time to figure out the right medication that works for you and all that sort of thing. People that don't really have the disorder don't really want to take medication. So if you're not convinced that you've got the disorder and you're having all these side effects, the chance of you putting the medication away, particularly when you're manic, is going to be very high. So you need to be comfortable with the diagnosis. Psychotherapy, okay, really useful, can be very costly as well. So if you're not convinced that you've got the disorder, why must I go and do the psychotherapy? Why must I do the work? Changes to diet, changes to sleep management, changes to exercise. These are all things that can make you a lot more stable. Eating really well. Sleep. I generally get in bed by like 9, 9:30 at night. And if I'm awake until 12 o'clock at night, then I'm hard to be around for a couple of days afterwards. So those sorts of things can affect a person with bipolar disorder more than they may affect other people. And sleep disruptions is kind of a known trigger for episodes as well. Exercise, kind of keeping in shape. I mean, I kind of look at some of these things as also a very good reason to do these things. So for the average person, maybe it doesn't make that much difference if you eat that well, if you exercise, if you monitor, how much alcohol you're having. For me, it's like a really good excuse to be like, okay, well, I've accepted the diagnosis, how can I best manage this? And it's an excuse to exercise a lot, to try and eat really healthily, to try and keep my life as healthy as possible. So it's kind of a glass half full way of looking at it, but you kind of have to do that sometimes. So avoiding drugs and alcohol, you're going to have to learn about the disorder so you can better manage it. And then there's going to be stigma as well that comes with accepting that diagnosis. And that's going to be self-stigma, and that's going to be stigma coming from people outside. And maybe that's something that we should maybe talk about a little bit. Like, what are our kind of thoughts around stigma and how to deal with it? Anything?
My son, he doesn't want to go out anymore because he feels he's with a group of people that he's got nothing to say.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel worthy and feels uncomfortable because everybody's got their life, they're going on, and he's like, nowhere. So, and they keep inviting him out, but he doesn't want to go out because he feels, when he's with them, that he sticks out more, where they just treat him normal.
Yeah,
every emotion he feels is over the top.
And that self-stigma is a massive thing, and part of the problem, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is that you see how the illness is kind of portrayed, and you think, oh, that must be what I'm like. So I started paying attention as soon as I was diagnosed, and you'd see every character that was bipolar on a TV program or a movie was always manic. Because otherwise, what's the point of saying that they're a bipolar character? You know, this is Carol, she's bipolar, but she's taking all the meds and everything's going perfectly. There's no point in having the character. So you get this kind of real false sense of how serious the illness is. And I'm not saying that it's not serious, it's incredibly serious. But you get the sense that people are either manic or depressed the whole time. I mean, I think the last thing that I saw bipolar character on was Ozark. I don't know if any of you saw that, but it was Laura Linney's brother, and he played it incredibly well. He played a manic person incredibly well, but he wasn't taking his medication, and he was in an incredibly stressful situation. The other one was Homeland. I don't know if any of you saw Homeland with Claire Danes. So she was playing this bipolar person, and it was actually also a very good portrayal of somebody with bipolar disorder. But if stress is a trigger, then being a CIA operative working in like a place where people might cut your head off, that's probably quite stressful, I don't know. So you're looking at this person, you're like, that is realistic, but it's also, this person's not strategically managing their life in a way that is going to lead to them managing things very well. So it gives you a very distorted sense of what things are like. And I actually feel like psychologists and psychiatrists have to be very cautious about this as well, because it's not cheap to go and see a psychologist, it's not cheap to go and see a psychiatrist. So when do you think people are going to go and see them? When things are really falling apart. So they're also going to interact with people that are bipolar or whatever in situations where you're only seeing the very severe symptoms. And unless they are able to kind of take a kind of step back and really think about it and recognize that I'm seeing a misrepresentative sample of this group of people, that idea of bipolar is going to be made up of those encounters, and it's going to be a misrepresentative idea of those encounters. And I think that that's kind of one of the problems. And then there's this circular issue with stigma as well, in that because the stigma exists, people that are living successful lives, taking their medication, managing themselves well, they won't reveal themselves as being bipolar because you know what the social repercussions are going to be and what the repercussions at work are going to be. And I've definitely experienced that. I'm very open about it. My students know about it. Some of them are here. And I kind of chat about it because I do think that it's important that they see a different face of it to what they've kind of seen before. The other issue is that when there are people that are doing that, and when there are people that are managing themselves well, but they haven't mentioned that they're bipolar, then the only time that people are going to notice it is when something goes wrong. So then as it goes wrong, it's like, that's what it is. And so, yeah, it is a tricky thing to kind of deal with. Yes?
Just following on from what you said there, is it then a good idea, considering the stigma, if you are bipolar, do you disclose to an employer? And when do you disclose? Because unfortunately, it's with the stigma that's attached to bipolar, disclosing up front often means you either don't get the job or you get treated differently.
Yeah.
So
it's a tough thing. I find on dates it's seriously, it's like it's a very real kind of thing. So you're sitting and you're having a really nice time with somebody, and I know that I've been on dates where I'll be on like the third date, so things have gone well enough to go with it, and then you mention it, and you can just see the sort of, I mean, it really is, it's quite kind of scary, and you sort of think, well, maybe it's just in my head, but yeah, it's a difficult thing to know. And with employers, it's a hard one because you want to say to people, be more open about the disorder because you are functioning well, and therefore you'll shift the way that it's kind of seen. But at the same time, there definitely are consequences to doing it. And as much as anyone will say, we won't judge you, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, I'm not homophobic, I'm not, people will say those things because maybe sometimes they're not, but sometimes you kind of think that's the right thing to say. And you can kind of feel people saying, I'll never judge you because of X, Y, and Z. But you notice certain things. And I've also been working in positions where people don't know. And you'll walk into a room and you'll hear people having a conversation about bipolar disorder or somebody that they know, and you just sit like a fly on the wall and listen. And it's not through malice either. Like, I don't think that it's because people are trying to be nasty. It's because they've got a simplistic understanding of it, and all right, so that's quite an important thing to kind of point out. So a healthy person given this diagnosis would find life very challenging. So just if you're told you've got to take this medication, so you're perfectly normal, now you're given the meds, and you're getting headaches, and you're getting nausea, and you're having, your libido is getting thrown all over the place, and you can't really connect with people properly anymore, and you're feeling a little bit dead, and so now you don't have anything wrong with you, but this medication is quite difficult to work with. All the psychotherapy diets, changes to sleep. And changes to sleep is a big thing. You're out with friends and you're like, I've got to go home now. Like, because that's what I need to do. That it makes a difference. The stigma, having those conversations at work, so even if you function perfectly and you say to someone, I've got bipolar disorder, that's going to change the way that you treat it at work, social interactions, that kind of thing. Consequences of no diagnosis are the symptoms, and the symptoms of the disorder are really, really problematic. It should be mentioned that the suicide attempt rate in bipolar disorder is twice that in major depressive disorder. So if you've got bipolar disorder, you've probably got about a 15% chance of dying by suicide. It's about 20 to 40 times higher than the general population. I actually think it's probably higher than that. So it's an incredibly dangerous disorder to have, and mania can be, I prefer to have depression than to have mania, and that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but mania, you sort of wake up afterwards and you just look at the chaos that you've caused for a month or 2 months or however long it is, and it's really, really, that's the stuff that kind of haunts you, that sits with you and is difficult to deal with. You're very out of control, and you say things that you wouldn't normally say, and you act very impulsively, and you can hurt people's feelings that you don't want to hurt, and that can be, whereas depression, it's horrible. Let's not think that it isn't, but you're very withdrawn, whereas with mania you become very expansive. Okay, so I want to just finish this section before we have a break. And just talk about the complexity of the diagnosis and how it's made. So there is skepticism about diagnoses in psychology and psychiatry. Because it's made through a conversation, it's not made through something more empirical in terms of a blood test or an X-ray or something like that. I've said bones in your body, so you've got 206 bones. You can tell the doctor where it hurts, you can kind of point, they can move things around in different directions, and they can kind of figure things out, then they can X-ray you, and you can then maybe work out exactly what's wrong. But even then, it's not perfect. In terms of the brain, okay, so as opposed to 209 bones, there are about 90 billion neurons, these brain cells that are each communicating with about 1,000 other neurons. So you've got these trillions of connections kind of all speaking to each other at the same time. It's very hard to scan, and as we kind of talked about a little bit in terms of the genetics, you can't kind of say bipolar disorder is just because of this connection between this part of the brain and this part of the brain. There's lots of things going on, everything's affecting everything else, and so it's not as kind of clear cut. So people sometimes say, well, then it's just witchcraft. What you guys are doing is not science, it's not whatever, it's not real because we can't see it as clearly. The argument that I'd make about that is that if you do have 206 bones and there's all these sorts of things that can kind of go wrong, if you've got something infinitely more complicated, why would certain things not go wrong with that? I mean, things can go wrong with your heart, with your lungs, with every part of your body. Why would the most complicated part of your body not be vulnerable to things going wrong with it? And if these things are very complicated, then how would we figure out if this disorder does exist? And so the diagnostic process effectively involves working out if a certain cluster of symptoms are presenting at the same time. So the thing that's affecting bipolar disorder tends to affect a number of different things. So the diagnosis is never going to be made based on just one thing, but they're going to kind of look at it and go, are all of these things, or at least a bunch of these things, all happening more or less at the same time? And if that's the case, then we can be kind of confident that there's something going wrong in a very particular way in your brain. Okay. We'll have a break in a minute or two. I didn't realize it would take this long. So when I've lectured abnormal psychopathology before, these 4 Ds I found really useful because people kind of often say, well, I've been really happy before, I've been really sad before, I've felt very energetic before. And so I found these really useful in terms of making that distinction between what's kind of normal and what's abnormal. So like what's falls within the realms of shouldn't be diagnosed, whereas what falls in the realms of what should be diagnosed. So the first D is deviation. So how different is the behavior or the mood or the thinking from what's kind of considered normal? And if it's just a little bit different, then not really too much of an issue, but it's very different, then that's obviously a thing. So to give you a sense of this, I think that 9 days staying awake is a really good example of deviation, because that's not normal. Most people can't stay awake for 9 days. That's strange. So that's a high level of deviation in terms of energy. One of the symptoms of bipolar disorder in terms of the mania side is productivity, high levels of productivity. I wanted to just show you guys this book that I wrote. I wrote it in December 2012. So I started writing on the 1st of December and I finished writing it at the end of December, and I was working a full-time job. So that. And that's not normal, okay? And I really think that that's a useful thing to kind of think about, because people say, yeah, my energy levels were up. I was feeling very productive. That's very productive. I was going to work every day, I was coming home, and then I was just writing through the night, and kind of, that's weird, okay? It's not normal. So that deviation is an important thing. Dysfunction is the other thing. So is it causing the person problems? Is it causing the person an inability to function in their relationships, at work? That's obviously an important thing to consider. Then distress. Is it causing the person some sort of distress? Are they feeling... and that's a weird one, because when you're manic, you don't necessarily feel distressed at the time. When you're hypomanic, you definitely don't, but when you're manic, you might feel a bit of distress, because sometimes you feel like you are responsible for saving the world or something very grandiose. So there's a lot of pressure, but you also feel very positive and kind of good about it in a way. Yeah.
Can you recognize when you are in a manic state? Are you aware of it now?
To a degree. So the sort of most severe manic episodes I had was 2003, and then 2009, and then actually in 2020. And in 2020, I wrote a book, another book, in a couple of weeks. It's over there. And And because I understood the symptoms very well, I was like, okay, I've just written this so this book's a little bit, it's not as long, okay, but it's very academic, so there's a ton of referencing and whatever in it. And I wrote it in about 3 weeks, and I was like, okay, well, I know that is something that I do when I tend to be in a hypomanic or manic state, but I haven't really been feeling that I am. And it was during COVID, so I was actually in Durban with my parents, and I said to them, have you noticed anything different? And they were like, no. I got hold of my psychiatrist, spoke to him for an hour. He's probably the top bipolar psychiatrist in the country. He was like, I don't see any issue. Spoke to my psychologist for an hour. She didn't see any issue, and I was definitely manic. And even in London, when I was kind of doing these kind of strange things, people that had known me my whole life, they were like, John seems really happy about stuff and excited and whatever, but it wasn't as kind of crazy looking as you might think. And I know that mania can get to the point where it is incredibly obvious, but sometimes it's not that obvious. I would say as I'm moving into that state, if I start noticing that I'm enjoying music more than normal, or that I'm just really like finding things to be quite amazing and engaging and that sort of thing, then, and my sleep I'm requiring less sleep, then I'll take a step back. But if I don't catch myself early enough, then it can progress into full mania. And there's maybe sometimes a window where you can catch yourself, but sometimes you can't.
How do you come out of that?
I was going to say, and what do you do when you catch yourself then?
So for me, it's about disengaging from anything that stimulates me. So like whether it's YouTube or TV or music or interacting with other people, often going to the psychiatrist and just saying, give me something to allow me to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So often just getting sleep for a couple of days in a row will slow me down. Like those are some of the things that I can do. Because basically what happens when you're manic is you're like chasing things. So they speak about, this is a great book called The Archaeology of Mind by Jaak Panksepp. He's kind of considered the founder of effective neuroscience, so basically the neuroscience of moods. And he speaks about the seeking system. And I think that the seeking system plays quite a big role in mania. And it's about just chasing things. So that's why people don't sleep, is because it just seems like the next thing that I do is going to be amazing. The next thing that I do is going to be amazing. It's and being able to kind of cut that intuitive desire to go and chase the next thing and just be like, okay, I know that I'm in a problematic state. Let me take a step back. That can allow things to slow down. It's like, don't keep feeding the beast is how I sort of think about it. Sorry, I just want to finish this slide and then we can maybe take a break. Sure. All right, so dysfunction, distress, and I mean, if you think of some of the like antisocial personality disorders, another disorder where there's not necessarily always going to be a huge amount of distress. Sometimes people who are antisocial don't really care too much about whether what they're doing is problematic, and it may not be affecting them too much. So then sometimes you look at danger as well. So is this person a danger to other people, and then a danger to themselves? And that's not a necessity. I would like to just comment on that before the break. So there are studies that show that people with bipolar disorder are more likely to be aggressive and more likely to be violent. And it's important to kind of, the devil's in the detail with studies like that, because when you remove the effects of alcohol in particular, then you start seeing the same levels of aggression and violence as you do in the general population. So because people with bipolar disorder as a group has got such a high level of substance abuse, you start seeing as a group they've got a high level of violent behavior than the general public. But when you remove that particular variable, then it evens out quite a lot. And I think that those are some of the things that can affect stigma as well. So you just hear that thing and you're like, oh, bipolar people, violence, very simple kind of connection, as opposed to understanding, oh, well, bipolar people, maybe some of the brain systems that are responsible for addiction and those sorts of issues are also involved in bipolar disorder. Therefore, this group of people has got some substance abuse or high levels of substance abuse. Therefore, this group of people as a whole, high levels of violent behavior. So yeah, that's starting point. We'll run through the actual symptoms after the break, but of course, we'll take 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. Just running through some of the other basics that you might come across, the different types of bipolar disorder. So you've got bipolar 1 disorder, which basically means you've at least had one manic episode. And that's that episode with the symptoms we're going to discuss that lasts 7 days or more. And often it lasts, as minded, 3 months, 4 months, they can be a lot longer, but 7 days or more, and it's the most extreme elevation. Alright? Depressive episode is not necessarily required for diagnosis. So if you have the manic episode and it's diagnosed, then you can be diagnosed as bipolar 1. There's a pretty good chance that you're going to have the depression as well. There's very few people who just experience the elevated side without the depression, but you don't need it for the diagnosis to happen. Bipolar 2, one hypomanic episode, and a hypomanic episode is an episode that's elevated, all the same symptoms as a manic episode except no psychosis, and the symptoms are a bit milder. They don't necessarily interfere with your social or occupational functioning, that kind of thing, and it has to be at least 4 days long. You have to have a depressive episode as well for the diagnosis to be made. Alright? So that's about 0.5% of the population, 0.5% of the population. And then you've got this kind of other group, and I don't even know if the DSM-5 is kind of looking at cyclothymia anymore, and other forms of bipolar disorder not otherwise specified. But effectively, cyclothymia is often considered a kind of longer-term, almost more chronic form of bipolar disorder, even though they're all lifelong, but it's kind of constantly moving between sort of hypomania and a mild level of depression.
So no normal mood in cyclothymia.
Well, you're going to be moving through the normal mood, but it's basically not full-blown depression and hypomania. And it tends to be like a longer-term thing. Things to maybe pay attention to as well is rapid cycling and mixed episodes. So rapid cycling is the idea that these episodes are happening quite regularly, and we often have this caricatured idea of bipolar disorder, people sort of bouncing from mania to depression. To be diagnosed as rapid cycling, you need to have 4 or more episodes in a year, which is not that much. That could be 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, assuming there's no period of normal. That's not like up one day, down the next day. And only about 1 in 8 people with bipolar disorder is diagnosed with rapid cycling. You do get ultra-rapid cycling, so there are a couple, a smaller group of people that does have that very rapid movement up and down, but that's not the typical way that bipolar disorder presents itself. And then mixed episodes. So mixed episodes effectively means that you're going to be experiencing some of the symptoms of mania and some of the symptoms of depression at the same time. And that can be a very difficult form of the disorder to have. It's very difficult to manage it and treat it because you're not predominantly focusing on the person kind of keeping down or kind of there's just a lot going on. So psychiatrists find it more difficult to deal with people that are experiencing episodes. Yeah.
Why would somebody experience that? What changes? So I experience mixed episodes, and it is very difficult to manage the medication to find that middle ground where you're not too high but you're not too low.
I'm not too sure. I sometimes experience them as well. So there's often like a lot of fear and kind of anxiety mixed with a huge amount of energy. So there's like a mania, but it's not a happy mania. It's like a mania with a lot of fear. I don't want to speculate too much. I kind of feel in my own case, I'm very nervous of the mania now. So I've started to associate mania with something that's really bad. So when I start moving into that elevated state, I start getting kind of all these connections with horrible things that have happened before. So it can't just be this pure happy feeling anymore. There's probably, experts around the world who look at that and be like, that's not a great explanation. That's kind of how I feel. But it's a kind of confusing space to be in. All right, so you're not going to be able to read this, but let's just quickly run through this. So diagnosing a manic episode, a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, so high, euphoric, feeling incredibly good, expansive, meaning wanting to interact with everyone. So my Facebook, I used to have, still wasn't a lot, but I used to have quite a couple of friends on Facebook, Facebook friends, people that aren't really your friends, some of them, and I've just wiped most of them off because I know that if I'm in a manic state, I'm going to share things, I'm going to maybe say things, and there's people that I know well that I feel comfortable with if something like that happens, but the others that they don't necessarily know my background, and so I'd rather not expose myself to so many people like that. Similar to the credit card thing, spending can be a big thing. People keep getting hold of me, would you like to increase your limits? I'm like, no. That's about as much as I can afford to blow if I haven't had a manic episode. Or irritable mood. So it can be irritable, which kind of is similar to that. It's a little bit like a mixed state. So you've got this elevated level of energy, and think about having 30 cups of coffee. You might become a little bit more irritable as well. Like that increased level of energy is going to be aligned with increased irritability. Then during that 7-day period, 3 or more of the following symptoms have persisted. Inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, so generally really high levels of confidence, feeling like you can basically do anything, feeling like you can achieve anything, feeling like the world is amazing, and grandiosity, I'm the second coming. That's happened to me a couple of times, seriously. And you think you'd learn from that. You think you'd be like, okay, that was silly. Next time, I won't let that happen again. And this feeling just kind of, it's very convincing. That's all that I can kind of say. But a lot of those sorts of things, I feel like I am the leader of this country. I feel like people have appointed me and that I've got this special mission to do. I feel, so you get these kind of delusional thoughts about yourself. Yeah.
My husband's cousin told everybody he was leading an expedition to the North Pole and he was involved in excavating. He posted it all on Facebook. So it's exactly involved.
Yeah.
He's not just has nothing tied into that, and that was one of the signs when you saw me.
And we'll get onto why people can think these things. So remember that relationship between thinking and mood and behavior. When mood kind of just gets crazy up there like that, thinking sometimes just moves up there as well to kind of be in line. Otherwise, it feels kind of off. So decreased need for sleep, we've spoken about that. More talkative than usual or pressured speech. So often if you speak to somebody who's manic, I don't know if you've been around a lot of people who are doing a lot of cocaine, but they're just like, they literally can't get their words out fast enough because they're just they have that kind of pressured speech. You see similar things with people that are manic. Flight of ideas or subjective experience that thoughts are racing. So flight of ideas is really just kind of having a conversation with this person. They start speaking about one thing, and they start speaking about something else, and then they start speaking about something else. There's a lack of order to what's kind of going on. And I'll talk a little bit about bipolar disorder and creativity. It's a really well-researched thing. So people that are bipolar are very overrepresented as writers, as artists, and that sort of thing. And creativity, and even creativity and delusion, are very closely related. So what you are experiencing as a person jumping from idea to idea is to them is these ideas are related to each other because they're seeing these kind of creative associations between various ideas. If you think about delusion is really a person thinking something that's definitely kind of demonstrably not true, but there's a great book called Madness Explained by Richard Bentel, and he basically says, if you sit with these people that are delusional, often you can actually understand how they are making these connections. So what seems like something that's completely insane, if you actually spend a lot of time with them, you can kind of figure out what they're talking about. Not that it makes sense and not that it isn't delusional, but you can kind of see the relationships and how they kind of got there. I'll show you an example of that of mine in a second. Distractibility. There's something about salience. Do you know what I mean when I say salience? Like importance, significance. So if something's salient, it means that it seems relevant or important. Again, with delusion, it seems like the salience network is involved in that sort of thing. So you see something and that seems really important relative to this thing, whereas a normal person would be like, it's not that important. And so all of these things seem to be connected to each other because everything seems far more important than what it is. And with distractibility, you're assigning importance to this thing, and then you see something there, and it's, oh, that seems really important, and that thing seems really important. So it's distractibility, and it's interesting. So some of the drugs that are used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, for example, what have you got? Concerta, Adderall, Ritalin. Those are the three main ones. And most of them are stimulants, so they're basically pushing up dopamine, and dopamine is part of that attention, that salience network. So it allows you to focus on things, and it seems that, at least according to one of the theories, that dopamine system is really important in bipolar disorder as well. So that increased kind of sense of importance, really need to focus on that. Okay. So we get on to goal-directed activity. Again, I'll get you to say that. So let me just make that point. Goal-directed activity, super focused on getting something done. So it's somebody with just this unbelievable level of concentration on something where they just want to, like that book. Okay, it's an abnormal level of trying to get something done, whether it's getting fit or whether it's going to the North Pole or whether it's whatever. It's just suddenly a huge level of focus on something that's not quite normal. Yeah.
So how do you support that one who you can recognize is going through a manic episode? So what's been helpful for you?
In terms of supporting somebody who's going through it.
And you know that it's delusional in a way.
It's very difficult once it kind of gets to a certain point to do much about it. I always ask my family and friends to kind of call me out when they see things starting to move in a particular direction. It's far easier to address it early on than it is when a person's fully manic. Because once you're in that state, I feel like I'm somebody who's relatively introspective, but you're so kind of caught up in what's going on, and there's so much information kind of flowing through your mind that you feel like it's impossible to communicate it to anyone else, so nobody else can really understand. So people can try and empathize with you, but they can't really, because you've got all these ideas and they just don't know they don't get it. That's what you're thinking. They just don't understand how important this is and how important I am and how necessary this thing is to get done. So, I mean, again, that's a clinician kind of question. Get them to take their medication. Hopefully they haven't gone off their medication. Yeah, I'm not really 100% sure. Goal-directed activity, increased involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. So that's basically impulsive behaviors. So we see things like excessive spending, reckless driving, gambling, foolish business decisions, promiscuity, like things that the person wouldn't normally do, they're far more likely to do. And again, it's because of this distorted perception of this is going to be great. This is a good idea. This thing that's not a good idea seems like the consequences are going to be good. If there's a problem, I'll be able to deal with it because I'm this incredible person and the world is beautiful and the future's bright and everything's going to work out perfectly. It just feels like that. As opposed to when you're depressed, and even if objectively the world is okay and people love you and you've got a job and whatever, it feels like you're worthless and the future's dark, you may as well kill yourself. So there's no rationality about it, it's just a feeling, a sense of things. Okay. Importantly, the episode isn't attributable to like certain drugs. Even giving somebody something like cortisol, so stress hormone, can trigger a manic episode. So the person diagnosing it has to rule out those things, has to rule out other possible causes. Is it maybe borderline personality disorder? Is it maybe schizophrenia? Is it maybe because of drugs? Is it maybe like whatever? Is this the most likely thing? Great. And I would always suggest that go and get a second opinion. Don't go to the second person and say, this person diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, what do you think? Just go and say, this is what I've been going through, and that will allow you to feel comfortable with the diagnosis. Okay. So this is quite an interesting thing that I thought that I just mentioned, because this was quite an example quite a good example of a delusion. So in 2012, my PhD research is on these very kind of weird, abusive personal development trainings and how it relates to bipolar disorder. And I was in kind of a hypomanic state, and this kind of gets to the creativity and linking ideas sort of things, and I was watching the movie Fight Club, and I was like, this all seems to relate to this industry that I've been studying for the past couple of years. So then I went to my psychologist the next morning, and I was like, hey, I found a hidden message in this movie, Fight Club. And if you're a psychologist and you've got a bipolar patient and they come in and they say they found a hidden message in a movie that nobody's ever found before, you'd think, okay, John, maybe we get you on your medication and let's just calm down. And so I tried to explain it, so it was very difficult to explain. And I sort of forgot about it for a while. And eventually, when I finished my PhD in 2017, I wrote an appendix where I explained things as clearly as possible. And because my PhD covered the stuff that was relevant, anyone that read the appendix would be able to kind of go, oh, okay, it sort of made sense. And then after that, I sent it to this website that deals with David, the producer, director, David Fincher's work. And this guy read it and was like, this all makes 100% sense. And I just found that interesting. So I called it dissecting a delusion because initially it was thought to be delusional, but it really was just a kind of creative association. So I was able to go, oh, that relates to that, that relates to that, that relates to that, and other people hadn't sort of picked it up before. And yeah, I find it kind of useful to use it as an explanation because generally with something that is delusional, it's quite unrestrained. And it's kind of something related to something that happened to you on the way to work, and then a person that drove past you in a car, and then there's all these things going on that you can never really explain to somebody. And so it just seems like complete madness, and sometimes it is. This is nice because it's something that seems delusional, but it's kind of slightly on that other side of delusions. It's kind of creativity, whereas if you've got a little bit more context, it does actually make a bit of sense. Okay, hypomanic episode, very basically less extreme, 4 days or less, and doesn't involve psychosis, meaning delusions and hallucinations. If you are hospitalized, it becomes manic. So immediately it becomes bipolar 1 if you're hospitalized. All right. Okay, we won't run through the depressive symptoms, but I think most of us have got some sense of depression. Yes?
Pretty well, yeah.
All right, so just in graph form to maybe give you kind of a sense. This isn't about the time period, this is just about the severity. So normal mood, most of us kind of fluctuate a little bit, blue line. Bipolar 2, you have slightly above the blue line, and then the full level of depression. Bipolar 1, you only need that very extreme manic state. Generally, you are going to experience that full depression as well. Okay. And then this, I thought was quite kind of useful because people sometimes think, well, bipolar 1, well, that sounds like the really bad one. Bipolar 2 is not quite as bad. They have noticed that people that are bipolar 1 tend to spend about 55% of the time symptom-free. So it's the majority of the time they actually are symptom-free. 30% of the time they're in a manic state. And that's got something to do with the fact that the episodes can last a really long time. If it lasts more than 4 days, then it becomes a manic episode, then you become bipolar 1. So bipolar 2, only a very small percentage of time is spent in a hypomanic state, but a very high percentage of time is spent in a depressive state. And that's also why they sometimes have a difficulty distinguishing bipolar 2 from major depressive disorder. Okay.
So is it not kind of a chemical imbalance?
Well, it's a simplistic way of kind of looking at it, but everything that kind of goes on in your mind has got to do with chemicals. And it's got to do with, so to say it's a chemical imbalance, I mean, being happy is a chemical imbalance, as opposed to being sort of in a normal mood. So it has got something to do with that. We'll chat about that now. Okay, so section 3, what is mood, and what does mood have to do with the other symptoms? So I think mood must be distinguished from emotions. Okay, so mood is more of this baseline state that you're in that doesn't sort of just bounce around like this, whereas emotions can be, very transient. So, for example, emotion, I feel happy, focused on the present, mood is life is good. So you often hear these stories of people that, for example, have committed suicide, and people say, but I saw the person just yesterday, and he or she was laughing and smiling and whatever. Mood was really low. Emotions may have been up during that period. I know that I've been quite depressed at times, and I'll have a laugh, and then the people disappear, and then I'll just be overwhelmed with a sense of despair and loneliness and hopelessness and that kind of thing. Okay, some questions to get some interaction. Just come up with relatively quick answers. They're not supposed to be long things. Okay, so first one. Just try and think of an answer, don't tell me what the answer is, keep it in your head. Okay. Second question. They want good answers.
Mm-hmm.
No.
I don't know, but it kind of breaks the game, so.
Okay. Doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. Actually, it's not going to help if you're right. Okay. So, total cost of a bat and the ball is 110 rand. What is the cost of the ball? If the bat costs 100 rand more than the ball. Anyone?
Yeah, it's just 1.
Somebody say 10?
That's what I said to him, but I know that there's a catch.
5.
Okay, so you're correct in the back. So a lot of people say that the answer is 10. So that's a very common answer. So if the bat costs 100 rand more, then the bat costs 110 rand. So that if you add them together, that would be 120. But the total is 110. So the ball must cost 5 rand and the bat must cost 105 rand. Right? It's straightforward. There's no, mathematically it's not too difficult for you guys to work out. But it's very tempting for you to say that the ball costs 10 rand. Okay. Next question.
Stacey, do you remember this one?
No, I don't. You pick it on me, G.
Yeah, because you read the book.
I said I remember reading it, but I can't remember.
Okay, so
Sorry.
Then you want to say 24.
most people want to say 24. Obviously the answer is 47 days, because at 47 days then it doubles.
Yeah.
So on the final day.
There we go.
Okay, so does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Alright, so the reason that I asked these questions is this is something called the cognitive reflective test. Usually it's 3 questions, this is 2 of the 3 questions. And it's basically pointing out the fact that most of the mental processes that allow us to make sense of the world operate automatically and without our awareness. So the way that our minds work is that we aren't consciously, intentionally thinking about things in order to make sense of the world. We're kind of using shortcuts the whole time. If we had to try and do that deliberate hard thinking all of the time, which would have got us the right answers in both of those things, then our prefrontal cortex would explode because it would just be too much work. So that's a contained question. Think about life. Think about your own value. Think about the future. These are far more complicated questions that involve so many other things kind of going on. We're not rational and whatever in terms of thinking about these sorts of things. So do I have value? That's a question that's got a lot of different things to think about. What's the future going to be like? A lot of different things too. So often it's our mood that's kind of just guiding us in terms of saying, yeah, I feel like things are going to be good. I feel like I've got worth, etc. Our mood is often the mechanism by which those shortcuts are being made. Okay, so and that was just important because often when we look at people that are depressed or manic, we kind of go, that's so irrational. Why would that person do that? Why would that person think that? Why do they feel that about themselves? You can logically know, but that's not how our minds tend to work. Alright, so it's quite useful to kind of break down your thinking into the rational mind and the intuitive mind, and this is a great book, Thinking Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman. If you haven't read it, really great book on these two different minds. He speaks about system 1 and system 2. System 1 is kind of the intuitive mind. It's very quick. It kind of takes shortcuts, does what you were all doing, or most of you were doing to kind of get the answer to that question. System 2, a lot kind of slower, more deliberate, takes more effort, kind of challenging. System 1 used more than we think, kind of like an autopilot. System 2 used a lot less than we think. We're not as rational as we think. Okay. And mood is often used as evidence for system 1. So that shortcuts, often it's just how we feel. Okay, so this is kind of what's going on in the brain. Again, neuroscientists would kick me. But you've got the outer part of the brain, so you've got the cortex, particularly the prefrontal cortex. That's the part that's developed most recently in terms of our evolution. That's what separates us from lower level animals. I don't know if that's the politically correct way of describing it, but that's the part that allows us to think very deliberately and to plan and to do all that kind of thing. And then you've got the sort of soft, juicy center of the brain parts, like the limbic system, and that's got more to do with emotions and that kind of thing. And these things are talking to each other quite a lot. So even if you think of like a cognitive therapist, the goal of the cognitive therapist is to provide you with information, like for example a depressed person, give them information and evidence to look at so they can kind of go, actually life's not that bad, and then the mood kind of gets a bit happier, and then they're in line. The psychiatrist tends to be doing stuff that's going to be affecting the mood side of things, and so then the mood gets elevated in the depressed person, and then the thinking falls in line with that mood. But those two things, it's very difficult for your mood to be really low, and then your thinking to be really positive. Those things are always kind of moving together. Okay. Alright, so if your mood is kind of normal, then your intuition is going to be normal, but if your mood moves out of that normal space, as we see in bipolar disorder, then your thinking and behavior is likely to kind of follow suit. So we typically think that these things line up with each other. So if experiences are good, then we think that mood is going to be good. And if experiences are bad, then mood is going to be bad. What we start seeing with bipolar disorder is that if your mood is really good, then the experience becomes good. Or that possible thing that you're going to do seems like a good idea, or whatever it is. And if your mood is really bad, then all those things seem pointless. That's why a depressive person doesn't want to go and have a conversation with anyone. It's going to be terrible. I don't want to go out. I don't want to see people, because my anticipation of pleasure is that there's going to be no pleasure coming from it. Manic person, everything's going to be amazing. So why sleep? You're just motivated to kind of keep going. All right. So mood is the lens through which we intuitively see ourselves, the world, and the future. When our moods are low, our views of ourselves and the world and the future tend to be very low. So you've got yourself, through this lens, and then the outcome is basically how you sort of see things. I think that this is a really nice example. So this is from the 2 books that I recommend by Kay Redfield Jamison. So she's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, and she's got bipolar disorder. And this is one of the books that I recommend to a lot of people. This is her, like a memoir, An Unquiet Mind. I think it's kind of sad that we have to rely on, like, she's probably in her 80s now, like women living in Baltimore as South Africans, because I think all of our experiences are so shaped by the society that we're in. But she does give a good sense of what the experience is like in this. This is another book by her, but this is more of an academic book. This is on the relationship between creativity and bipolar disorder. It's called Touched with Fire. And she mentions a number of different artists and poets and novelists and that sort of thing. Tolstoy, obviously, the famous Russian writer that wrote War and Peace. And I think that this is great because it shows this disconnect between reality and how he was feeling. And he's talking about depression in this case. And he says, and there I was, a fortunate man, carrying a rope from my room where I was alone every night as I undressed, so that I would not hang myself from the beam between the closets. And I quit going hunting with a gun so that I would not be too easily tempted to rid myself of life. And this was happening to me at a time when, from all indications, I should have been considered a completely happy man. This was when I was not yet 50 years old. I had a good, loving and beloved wife, fine children, and a large estate that was growing and expanding without any effort on my part. More than ever before, I was respected by friends and acquaintances, praised by strangers, and I could claim a certain renown without really deluding myself. And I think it's really powerful because you've got this person who obviously their life is fantastic, but they just wanted to die.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah.
And then kind of how Tolstoy ended, where he actually did drop everything. It's almost like a manic episode, where he headed off. He said, in line with his theories, that he wanted to start everything from scratch. It was almost like he was in one of those states, perhaps.
Possibly. I haven't looked at him much, other than reading 1 or 2 of his books.
Yeah.
I don't actually know too much about how it ended. But I mean, these are wonderful examples of that disconnect between reality and how a person is feeling. You've got Edgar Allan Poe, the poet, who was bipolar as well, said, "My feelings at this moment are pitiable indeed. I'm suffering under depression of spirits, such as I've never felt before. I've struggled in vain against the influence of this melancholy. You'll believe me when I say that I'm still miserable in spite of the great improvements in my circumstances." And these are these things that we have to understand with depression. And then finally, the poet William Cooper, "You'll tell me that this cold gloom will be succeeded by a cheerful spring, and endeavor to encourage me to hope for a spiritual change resembling it, but it will be lost labor." And that's kind of arguing that any cognitive approach is not necessarily going to work on that, because his feelings are dominating, his intuitive mind is dominating his rational mind. That's maybe the simplest way of kind of putting it. Okay, right, so we have the opposite thing going on when our moods are positive. Okay, we did have this conversation about chemicals. And it kind of goes back to the diagnosis side of things. You know, just because we can't see things in terms of a broken bone or an x-ray or a blood test or whatever, we do know that chemicals affect the way that we feel. And this is simplifying it a bit as well, but we know, for example, that nicotine impacts a chemical called glutamate. It impacts dopamine as well. We know that alcohol impacts something called GABA, which tends to just relax us a lot, but it also hits the reward pathway, so the dopamine circuit. And then caffeine affects something called adenosine, which and a number of other things, but also affecting dopamine. And dopamine is very reinforcing in its effect. It basically says, that's awesome, you should do that again. So we've got this dopamine system in our brains, and it's referred to as the seeking system by Panksepp because it gets us to focus on things and try to get them. So things like food, sex, social interactions, natural things that are important for life dopamine gets elevated when we interact with those things, and it says, remember this, remember how to get it, that's really important. So we've got the system that's really important for survival. Drugs tend to hijack that system. So as opposed to actually doing the thing that's important for survival, which then leads to an elevation in dopamine, these drugs just kind of go straight to that center and go push it up, and it says that alcohol's really important, that cocaine's really important, that whatever's really important. And it kind of bypasses the actual thing that's natural that you really do need to survive.
Would you call it artificial dopamine?
Well, it's not. So, I mean, none of these things put dopamine into your system. So you've got dopamine in your system. So say, for example, cocaine. If you... quick neuroscience lesson. So the way that our brains work is that our neurons are kind of communicating with each other. So there's 90 billion of them. They're each connected with like 1,000 other ones. And so you've got this neuron, which is basically going to send a message to this neuron. And we'll just focus on 2 because I don't have enough hands to do all 90 billion. But this one is kind of going, okay, I'm going to send out whatever the chemicals are that I tend to produce. So say the ventral tegmental area, generally the chemicals that are going to be produced is dopamine. So it sends out some dopamine, and then you've got this thing, this other neuron over here that has to receive some of the dopamine. The more dopamine that it receives, okay, the more dopamine that kind of binds to this chemical, the stronger the signal sent from this one to this one. So what happens with cocaine is you've always got dopamine in your system in these neurons, but when you send out the chemical, it sort of floats around and it binds over here, and then after a while, this neuron will say, okay, I'm going to collect it back up now, because it's bound enough. I'm going to collect up all the dopamine that's still floating around there. And there's things called transporters that collect it back up. Cocaine basically kicks the transporters in the stomach. That's kind of what cocaine does. So it doesn't produce more cocaine. It just says all these transporters that would be collecting up the dopamine, it stops them from doing that. So these dopamine's just floating around here for longer and longer and longer, and binding and binding and binding and binding, so the chemical seems much stronger. Okay, so that's generally how the neurons are communicating with each other. Amphetamine does something slightly, it's also elevating dopamine, but in a slightly different way. It actually flushes out the dopamine from this neurotransmitter, so there's more to bind on here. So they're both increasing the signal, but in slightly different ways. One of the major theories around bipolar disorder, by the way, is the dopamine hypothesis. So it suggests that dopamine plays a big role. But more generally than that, there's this hypothesis that there's a homeostatic problem between the neurons that are generally functioning in people with bipolar disorder. And what that means is that homeostasis is about being in balance. So clearly bipolar disorder is a kind of case of a problem with homeostatic balance. In terms of the homeostatic issue with bipolar disorder, the argument is that when you release a ton of these chemicals and they start binding here, for example using cocaine or alcohol or whatever it happens to be, then the receptors that are receiving the chemicals here, after a while start going, I'm getting a little bit too much information, I'm going to start shutting some of these down. Because that's one way for me to regulate how much signal I'm getting. And so if you overload any sort of system with too much of a neurotransmitter, you should be getting a shutdown of these things on the postsynaptic neuron to make sure that the signal is more or less what it should be. And then if there's too little dopamine, then more receptors should open up because it should become more sensitive. So if there's just a few, you'll get more or less the right signal. That would be a good plasticity, good homeostatic mechanism working in the brain. The argument with bipolar disorder is that that isn't necessarily happening properly. So you might get way too many receptors being opened up and way too much dopamine being sent, or other chemicals being sent, and this isn't kind of shutting down quickly enough, or it shuts down way too much for a period of time, and that leads to depression. I'm really simplifying it a lot, but the argument is that that ability to kind of open up receptors and close receptors and kind of change under different circumstances is problematic in bipolar disorder. And let me just finish the thoughts and I'll get to you. When we turned the lights off earlier on, how dark did it seem for a little while? Not as light as it does now.
Yeah.
Very much the same thing. Okay, so our eyes are kind of also operating using receptors, and because we could be walking into an area with less light, receptors start opening up, and it's like, okay, let more light in. But if we walk outside now, then they're going to go, hopefully they're going to go, oh, we better shut that down, because otherwise it's going to be problematic. And if it didn't do that, you'd be getting in way too much light, which, if you're thinking about way too much mood, might be the equivalent with bipolar disorder. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, sorry, question.
I just wanted to see with the related substance abuse disorders with bipolar, do we see a greater variety of the substances they're using? I'm thinking like uppers and downers if they're trying to self-medicate and maybe get rid of the effects.
I actually don't know enough about it.
Okay.
I mean, I just know that it does seem like a lot of people, and it's a very common thing with men, generally with substance use disorders, to use substances rather than acknowledging a diagnosis and getting treatment.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know, toxic masculinity, I don't know. It seems to be less the case in my generation, but certainly in the past, like men are less likely to be diagnosed with depression as well. They're far more likely to be diagnosed with substance abuse issues because they'll find some way of trying to manage their moods using chemicals. It's just that it's not a very controlled way of doing it. It's not like sometimes I'm having my medication and I'm like, oh, I feel like just having 30 times tonight. Like I'm just going to binge on this lithium, you know? Yeah. That's not how it works. You know? Okay, so prescription medication is effectively doing the same thing. As I've said, Adderall, Concerta, Ritalin, elevating dopamine in a particular way, which is improving focus and that kind of thing. Okay, so these are important things. So can these chemicals in our brains change without ingesting some sort of drug or substance? And the clear answer is yes. Like every thought that you have shifts these brain chemicals in some way. And then obviously very extreme thoughts are going to shift these chemicals in very extreme ways, which is why major life events or stressful situations can throw your mood off. So it's just as an exercise. Think about cheesecake. I don't know who likes cheesecake. Anyway.
Just a
I'm
little.
glad I chose something that everyone's. So, if you like cheesecake, then what's going to be going on? There's going to be a lot of things going on. But one of the things that's going to be going on is that the ventral tegmental area in your midbrain is going to be starting to shoot out dopamine. And it's going to be attaching to your nucleus accumbens, which is like part of your striatum. And it's going to be saying, focus on that. Think about that. Some of you probably are now kind of going, how do I get out of this talk? So I'm going to choose right now. And so just by getting you to think about something, I've got your brain to change in a very particular way. Okay. And the system is really about, it's not just, they used to think of it as the reward pathway. So there was this study done by Olds and Milner in like 1952. It's like probably the most famous study in neuroscience, where they put electrodes into rats, into various parts of their brains, and then they would basically get to see if the rats liked it or not. I'm not into animal experiments, but you know, in the 1950s they did some weird things. And they found if they put the electrodes into the one part of the brain, the rats would keep pushing this lever. And they would just keep pushing it. It was this ventral tegmental area releasing dopamine, and they thought it was the reward pathway. And these rats would carry on doing it. You put a pretty rat in the, I don't know what a pretty rat looks like, pretty rats next to them, they weren't interested. They didn't want sex, they didn't want anything, they just wanted to press this thing, give them food, they didn't want food. And these rats would press this button until they died. And we think, rats are so dumb. And then we look at people with substance abuse disorders and they're doing the same thing. That's exactly what's going on. It's this reward pathway. They just keep getting hit, even though it's not actually giving them anything useful. They're being told that they're getting the most useful thing, because that's what their biology is telling them. This is the most important thing. This is the most useful thing. And so they kept pressing the buttons, and eventually they die. And it seems like that this pathway has got something to do with bipolar disorder as well. Okay. We are sitting on nearly 11 o'clock. I maybe just want to finish this section before we take a break. Because this I think is quite a nice way of understanding a little bit about what hypomania and mania feel like. So can you guys think of a positive change of mood that almost every person experiences? It's quite significant in most people's lives. Yes, great. So falling in love. Okay, it's a long-term emotional state, distorts the lens through which we intuitively see ourselves, the world, and the future. And in the context of bipolar disorder, it causes noticeable changes to thinking, feelings, and behavior. So often when people say to me, like, what's mania like? I kind of say, well, like love, romantic love, and even love for a child, I guess, very similar in a lot of ways. There's some great quotes about love that I think are relevant. So love is a serious mental illness. You've got the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, who says love is a gross exaggeration of the difference between one person and everyone else. And you've got W. Somerset Maugham, who says love is a dirty trick played on us to achieve continuation of the species. And psychiatrist Anthony Storr says we know that there's no point in arguing with somebody who's in love. We may think the object of infatuation to be totally unworthy of such devotion, but it's quite useless to say so. The most reasonable and equitable people are not immune to love's charms and delusions. And I think that this is such a great example because, okay, for some of you it might be a little bit harder, but can you remember a time that you were in love? Anyone? Okay, some of you are like, no, that's a long time ago. Or, yeah. Do you remember being in love with somebody and then not being in love with them? Like, was there anyone that you loved and then you were like, you got past it? And you looked back and you thought, like, what was I thinking? Okay, so that's kind of like coming out of a manic episode. So think about being in love with somebody. You think that they're the greatest thing ever. You're thinking about them all the time. You're focused on them. They seem really important. You're thinking of ways to spend time with them. You're trying to, like, your day is totally absorbed with trying to get near to this person. And it's a useful thing to do in terms of reproduction, and it's a very useful thing to do, and this is sounding very scientific and cynical, but it is very useful to think the world of somebody that you're going to be spending time with. But then when you fall out of love with them, you're kind of like, what? I don't understand. And you have this really distorted perspective of what they were like. With mania, it's very much the same thing, except it's not focused on a single person. It's just more generally focused on everything. That idea seems amazing. That business opportunity seems amazing. That thing that seems kind of risky, that seems like a great idea. Everything excites you. Everything seems like it's going to lead to an incredible sense of promise, and it's just going to be wonderful. And even if you're aware of that, because most people are actually aware of that when they're in love, they're like, I realize that this person's probably not the most beautiful person in the world, but I think that they are. Like, so that kind of thing sits next to each other. I don't know if you guys have ever had somebody sitting next to you showing you pictures of their children/grandchildren. And here she is, singing a song. It's 5 minutes, hope you enjoy this. And that person thinks that they're doing you a favor. They think that that's like the greatest thing that they can be doing for you because they are in love. But when you're manic, it's kind of the same. Like, things just seem so much more fascinating and, amazing. So, brain scans have shown that romantic love heavily involves the chemical dopamine. So Dr. Helen Fisher put a bunch of people through a functional MRI. She showed them pictures of people that they were in love with and then other people, and she saw that this reward pathway just lit up when they saw people that they were in love with. Yeah, is she really the most beautiful woman in the world? And even if we look at romantic love and mania, there's quite a lot of overlaps. They're not the same thing, obviously, but you get this elevated mood in both. You get a sense of motivation in both, this desire to kind of do something to get whatever it happens to be. This level of optimism. There's that Beatles song. There were bells on a hill, but I never heard them ringing until there was you. There were birds in the sky, I never saw them ringing until there was you. Like, so you start noticing things. So that whole thing of just everything seems important and amazing and wonderful. Impulsive behavior, people that are in love tend to do impulsive things. Creativity, like more poems and books and things have been done in the name of love than I think in any other thing. Sleep and appetite can be changed. You've got this goal-directed behavior, so there's quite a lot of kind of useful overlaps between the two. Does that make sense to you? Do you kind of feel like you're getting some sense of what mania is like? It's obviously more extreme and more problematic.
Is it like a euphoria?
Certainly there's that euphoria that comes with romantic love as well. When you're manic, you do feel euphoric. So people talk about bliss, euphoria, feeling high, feeling ecstatic, all those kinds of things, yeah. Okay, so we're nearly done. So we should maybe take a break and then we go on to the last couple of slides. Thanks. Okay, and I've published a paper recently that relates to this. I wouldn't say that it's been wholly accepted by the academic community yet. It's only been published for about a week. But I'll kind of give you a sense of what my thinking is around this. So there was this theory in 1911 by one of these psychoanalytic theorists, Carl Abraham, who was a student of Freud, who spoke about the manic defense hypothesis. And the idea was that mania, these feelings of incredible self-worth and optimism and all that sort of thing, was an exaggerated defense against feelings of inadequacy and feelings of worthlessness. So if this person was feeling incredibly worthless, then mania was kind of a way of unconsciously countering those feelings of worthlessness. But in the case of a person with bipolar disorder or manic depression at the time, these unconscious feelings of being really worthwhile spiraled out of control and pushed this person into this manic state. And it was as I said, a psychodynamic way of looking at things. It couldn't really be proven or anything like that. And now my kind of thinking is that the brain is trying to do that. The brain is trying to keep the person in balance, and it does seem like there's a possibility that the brain is overcompensating at times, and sort of, as opposed to just keeping the person in balance, is pushing them massively into an elevated state. So, and this goes back to this homeostatic plasticity thing. So, if you've got a balance, and you've got something in life basically making you feel bad about yourself, you've got to find some way of balancing that out. Right? And then multiple ways of doing this. If you've got more things, then you need more things, etc. So the greater the challenge that's kind of coming at you, the greater your resources have to be in order to kind of keep yourself in balance. When that challenge disappears, you want the thing that's making you feel good to disappear accordingly. And if you don't have that plasticity, then you're going to have an issue. Because if you've got something telling you that you're amazing and nothing telling you that there's a problem, then you're going to be out of balance. And that is kind of what mania is going to look like. Right, so you want these things to kind of move together. Alright, I can't remember exactly where I was going with this. Okay, so if you've only got a little bit telling you that you're terrible, and all these things telling you that you're amazing, then it's going to be this real problem with balance. Okay, so in order to balance that scale out, if you've got a brain like a bipolar person's brain that doesn't seem to be capable of adjusting as quickly and as flexibly as other people do, then what you can do is you can try to balance out this side with other things that aren't necessarily chemical in your brain. And let me see if I can explain this. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the balance in terms of managing yourself can be done in 4 major different ways. Through strategic interventions, psychological, biological, and social interventions. And that means that, so imagine that dopamine, and simplifying things, is the only thing that is kind of balancing you out in your brain. You can either load up that one side of the scale with things that are made up almost only of dopamine, which means that if things change and your brain isn't good at regulating dopamine, then you're going to be out of balance. Or you can try to make up that balancing thing with these other things so that dopamine doesn't have to play as big a role. And when I say dopamine, I just mean your brain's flexibility doesn't have to be as much of a thing. So that's why I try to incorporate these major interventions to manage myself, and I would encourage other people to do it as well. All right. Okay, so we've spoken about the thing with the eye and the receptors and whatever earlier, so we've kind of covered that. Okay, so you can think of mania as taking in too much brightness, okay? When the brightness outside is already plenty. Instead of having a realistic view of the world, it becomes ultra positive. Okay. Alright, so let's have a look at these ways of, we'll get to those 4 things. Just looking at time, making sure that we cover everything. All right. Treating the disorder. First thing, is the diagnosis accepted? And that's the starting point. So if no, go back to the diagnosis, get another person to look at it. Like, until it's accepted, it's going to be an issue. If yes, okay, what can you do? You've got these different approaches. Biological medication is the main one. You cannot get away without medication. If you've been properly diagnosed, you have to do it. It's going to be a pain for some people. There's going to be side effects. You may have to try multiple different things before you get it right. You might feel a bit dead. You might feel a bit disconnected for a while, but it generally improves over time. I generally feel fine on medication. And it didn't take that long to find the right stuff for me. For other people, it can be different. Sleep, diet, exercise, avoiding drugs and alcohol. In terms of the psychological side of things, therapy can be really useful. So there's some forms of therapy that are specifically geared towards bipolar disorder. CBT still seems to be the one that has kind of got the most evidence behind it.
What is it?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
They also have, is it called dialectical and interpersonal rhythm therapy?
Yeah.
There's DBT, there's another one that's got to do with managing social interactions, family, kind of, the things that I'm going to talk about kind of bring all those things together. So, strategic things which I'll run through, so making intelligent decisions about your life, about your career, about your relationships, those sorts of things. Learning about the illness, learning your personal triggers. So I can kind of talk about things that I know throw me off, but for different people it can be different things. So you can't just go to somebody and say, tell me about what the bipolar triggers are. You're going to need to work that out for yourself. You're going to need to also learn to be quite introspective, to maybe note when things are wrong. You can have agreements with people in your life as well. If X happens, you have the right to do whatever. You can take my credit card away, or you can, those sorts of things can be quite useful. Social is really important. And I think that this sort of interaction is massive on the social side of things. So not feeling alone in your experience, feeling like somebody understands what you're going through can be a massive thing. Even if they are not doing anything other than showing that they understand. So with my father, for example, just reading a book and showing me that he'd read the book, whether he understood it or not, that was a huge thing. Because otherwise you sometimes do feel quite alone, you feel like it's lip service, you feel like, and then when that person's trying to give you advice to do things, you're like, well, you haven't even taken the time to work this out, if you really cared that much. So that does buy you, I think, some credibility with the people that you're dealing with. That's not to say that you should be doing all the work and they shouldn't be doing anything. Like, I've read these 30 books, and they're like, okay, well, that's nice, maybe you can tell me about them sometime. They should also be doing those things. So that's prevention, so that's kind of maintenance, and then there's acute symptoms. So if somebody's in a manic episode or in a major depressive episode, then they need to get like medication. That's the thing that can be done, if they will take it. The problem with mania is that people are often quite reluctant to stick to what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, we've kind of spoken about that. Who shall I tell about the diagnosis? I would say close friends that you really trust, family members that you trust. I would avoid work colleagues. Definitely don't tell your class if you're a lecturer. But yeah, you kind of have to gauge it as well. And I think if things are going really well and you've established, it's rough when that's the opening line, if you know what I mean. So if you start with that, then often people will anchor on that thing with you. So rather let them get to know you, get them to understand you, and get them to form an opinion. And I think that that's fair to you and to them. Yes.
You talked about telling friends or having somebody who you've given the right to say something. When do you have the right as that person to interfere to the point of saying you need to be hospitalized? if you have somebody who is refusing medication where you can see they spiraling out of control, when do you have that without infringing on their human rights?
So this is something that I've lectured on, but I probably need to go and look at it again. And I also wouldn't know who the person is who gets to make that call, but generally it's when the person is of danger to themselves and to others. Then you get to whatever it is, section name, I don't know what it's called.
Well, it's not necessarily going as far as sectioning, but getting them into a clinic where, yeah. How do you? Well, the thing is, you can't always convince them. So. No. And it's one of those from your own personal experience. What would your reaction have been if somebody had said that to you?
So, I'm generally pretty open when people tell me that I'm in a manic state. The last time that it happened, there was a period that I was probably too manic to respond to it well. But it was never like I was hostile to anyone. It was more just like I was kind of confused and trying to work out whether they were actually right or not. But something that helps a lot is knowing that the people in question have got good intentions. And so it's that level of trust that you've established with people that when they say something to you, you at least know that they're coming from a good place. But having said that, when it gets to a certain level, it's not easy.
Can I share something?
Yeah.
When my son got to such a manic state, he was out of control, and we were scared he was going to harm himself. My husband found a couple of doctors. Like I said, he's of an age where he has to make his own decisions. Nobody will come forward unless he accepts the help. So he had to go to a police station and get an affidavit, not an affidavit that, he had to sign an affidavit that my son was not of rational mind, and he called an ambulance. And the ambulance people came, and the one guy that came in and spoke to my son was absolutely amazing. I mean, he was manic, he was grandiose, he was out of control. And the guy just sat for an hour and let him talk and talk and talk and talk. And then he said to him, look, I am going to take you to hospital. He says, no, I'm not going, He says, well, we need to do your blood pressure, we need to do your tests. Will you let us? He says, yes. And then he brought his team in. And they were planning to actually sedate him. Because we didn't want to force him. I mean, it was horrific. But when they walked in, he said, so you guys are taking me to hospital? They said, well, first we're going to take your blood pressure, but eventually, yes, that's what it's going to be. He said, okay, let me get my ID. And he went.
Okay.
It's a very difficult situation, and so
we realised, I think, that we were trying to help them.
Yeah, but sometimes the person's not going to do that, and that's kind of why I sort of say that the work needs to be done to try and stay well as much as possible, because when it gets to that stage, it's never a good situation.
Yeah.
So, okay. Just the breakdown between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, for those of you who are not completely aware. Psychiatrist is generally going to be dealing with the medication side of things, particularly in South Africa. There's not many psychiatrists who are having long conversations with patients. Mine's quite good at that actually, but generally it's quite an expensive way to have a conversation with somebody. Really important, finding suitability, trying to find somebody who's got a specific focus on bipolar disorder. And I mean, psychiatrists are like any profession. They may have worked more with one group of people than another. My psychiatrist only focused on bipolar disorder, and I sought him out when I moved to Joburg, and I had to argue my way to become one of his patients because he's not taking any new patients. But it is really useful to have somebody who's not just a kind of jack of all trades. So establishing comfort and trust, there should be a real dialogue. And by real dialogue, I mean, you should be able to say to the person, this is making you feel terrible. And that person should listen to you and say, okay, fine, we'll try something else. So that I've had terrible psychiatrists before, and I've had some really good ones. So they're going to be diagnosing, prescribing the medication, monitoring the medication. With bipolar disorder, lithium is still a very common treatment, but it does require blood tests to be done regularly. It affects function of various organs, and you have to kind of monitor it and keep it within a certain range. Psychologist, also really useful. I probably don't see a psychologist enough. Often when I give talks, I sort of break down because I'm like, oh, I haven't spoken about that. All kind of comes out. But yeah, having that kind of conversation and having a safe space to share things with is really useful. As much as your family may love you, as much as your friends may love you, there's only so much that they want to talk about some of these things with you. So that can be incredibly useful, and just in providing really great strategies to manage some of the things that make life easier. I find routine is hugely important. It provides a sense of stability and structure and often psychologists are great at kind of clearing things up and giving you that structure that you need. Okay, this compromise, and I think that this may be of interest to you. So the person with the illness, responsibility to minimize the symptoms, educate yourself, learn to trust the people that are supporting you, and to do the work. And there's a lot of work involved. People, if you're supporting, trying to provide empathy, which requires doing something like this, learning about it, actually understanding something, and earning that trust. So you can't just be like, you should trust me, if you haven't even looked into the thing at all, if you don't really believe that it exists, if you're doubting whether the diagnosis is real, that's not supportive. So educate yourself, establish trust with the person, and provide support, but the work must come from the person in question. And both of you learning to recognize warning signs. So there's things early on, so before it gets to the stage that it's really problematic, often the person's more likely to accept an intervention, have a conversation, that kind of thing. Okay, always seriously consider concerns from other people. So if you've been diagnosed, if somebody says, I think that something's not quite right, to be able to kind of not be defensive, that's something you need to be deliberate about. And in the same way, if a person behaves in a way that's they're frustrated about something, they're angry about something, they're happy about something, don't always attribute it to bipolar disorder, because people can be happy and irritable and whatever, and that's micro-monitoring also can feel very uncomfortable to the person in question. Okay, so last thing, just running through these four different ways of transforming stresses, which are a major cause of these episodes, into something more manageable. Strategic, psychological, biological, and social. So taking these stresses, putting them through the filter, and coming up with something more manageable at the end. So strategic interventions, this is about avoiding stresses or minimizing the stresses. So don't get yourself into situations that are going to be problematic. I've kind of changed my life a lot to try to do that. So I was working in management consulting, I was working crazy hours, it was huge amounts of stress, and it was just a recipe for disaster. So this is something that I enjoy doing now. Lecturing is far more manageable. Not always, but it's generally, you've got the hours, you've got the marking, you've got the whatever, but there's a lot more structure to it. I can exercise, I can eat properly, all those sorts of things, and it allows me to do that. In terms of even the relationships that I have, I'm very kind of cautious of it, maybe too cautious, but avoiding people in your life that are causing you problems, avoiding hanging around with people that are drinking a lot, doing drugs, behaving in a way that you know is not going to be useful to you. So making those strategic decisions in life that allow you to live in a healthy way. Psychological interventions. Can you see the different ways that you can see the picture?
I'm currently getting old lady.
Okay, so there's old lady with a big nose like that, and then there's kind of a cowboy looking away. So the old lady's nose is his jaw, and then he's got his nose, and then that's his ear, her eye is his ear, and he's looking to the left like that. Okay, so the basic idea is that, psychological interventions and cognitive therapy in general allows you to reframe things, to look at things in a different way. So something that might seem like it's terrible, you can maybe look at it in a way that's more positive, that's more optimistic, that's more glasses half full. And often people that are depressed, so the depressive side in particular, involves these automatic thoughts, these automatic ways of seeing things that are really prejudicial to yourself and to everything around you, and having that ability to kind of shift those and see them in a different ways is really useful. Okay, we won't really go through that, but that's kind of speaking about the intuitive mind and then the rational mind. So again, people are disturbed not by events, but by the view that they take of it. So the automatic response is just this automatic thing. Something happens and you respond in a particular way. You can have a more considered, rational response to this, where you transform the way that you see things into something more positive or something more manageable. And that's something that a psychologist should be able to assist you with. Basic psychological techniques, okay, we won't really run through those. Things like thankfulness can be really useful. If you're not praying every day, just focusing on positive things can be helpful. Creating meaning from experiences, challenging unhelpful automatic thoughts. Creating meaning from experiences. So, like a nice example of that with me was, I had, in my manic episodes, I always felt like I was having a religious experience. And it's very common among people with bipolar disorder. And literally about a week ago, I had an article published which provides an explanation of that. So it was kind of taking something that was quite negative, quite scary, quite whatever, and going, okay, well, I've had this experience, it's a unique experience, other people don't have this insight, how can I use this to be something productive and positive? Okay, should make time. Biological interventions. That ship is going to be able to better withstand bad weather than that ship. And the goal is, as a person with bipolar disorder, to try to become more like that ship. That's about maintenance, that's about medication, that's about sleep, that's about diet. All of these kinds of things. So sleep, exercise, diet, sunshine, nature, breathing exercises, medication, avoiding drugs and alcohol. Those are all things that can affect you biologically. You need to eat certain things. Omega-3s are actually thought to be really, really good for people with bipolar disorder. So you can take the capsules, you can take, what is it cod liver oil? Probably don't want to do that. The tablets, I think, are a little bit more manageable. But these are, we spoke about the neurons communicating with each other, sending neurotransmitters. That's a picture of that. These neurons here, they're made up of good fats, so the omega-3s play a big role in that. Proteins that you have are necessary to make some of the actual neurotransmitters. So your brain function, it needs certain things. So this is not just about a diet that's going to make you look good. It's about a diet that gives you everything that you need. So getting those good fats, like the oily fish, the avocado, the almonds, the whatever, making sure you're getting enough proteins, avoiding sugars, those kinds of things are really important. And then finally, social interventions. And we've spoken about this already, but that sense of isolation can be really destabilizing for most people. Bad social connections can also be massively destabilizing. But having people around you that are stable, that care about you, that support you, that sort of thing, is hugely beneficial to anyone. So establishing those relationships, building those relationships, nurturing those relationships are really important as well. Okay, so in summary, showing an understanding of bipolar disorder demonstrates that you care. By recognizing what mood is and how it shapes thoughts and behaviors, you can better appreciate the thoughts and behaviors of those with illness. It can be useful to think of hypomania and mania as an exaggerated defense against psychological stress. By learning healthy ways to manage stress, there's less chance that hypomania and mania will occur. And then finally, it is a big challenge. You know, like for example, and I use the example of like a Comrades Marathon. It's pretty difficult to run 90 kilometers or whatever it is, but 10,000 people do it every year. They go through a process of getting themselves ready, so they've got this massive challenge, but they manage to get it done. And if you do that and you try to run 90 kilometers, you're going to die. It's going to be a disaster. You're not going to get 10 kilometers. So there's a very big, you can make a massive difference in terms of how you're managing yourself and the things that you do to make this really big challenge as kind of manageable as possible. So, yeah, try and do all the right stuff. All right, thanks everyone. Please let me know if there are any questions.
I know you said your psychiatrist isn't taking new referrals, but name, just in case.
It's Dr. Lee Janay.
Oh, yeah.
Is that your psychiatrist? He's very good. But he does a lot of research as well. And
do you know of any others?
I don't, because I came from Durban, so when I moved to Joburg, I just looked and saw if I could find somebody who was kind of a specialist, and I'd seen him doing some stuff before that he was kind of particularly focused on bipolar disorder, so kind of got hold of him, and yeah, it was difficult to. I was like, well, I've done a PhD on it, and I'm managing myself quite well, and probably within, because I arrived in 2019, 2020, he was, when I was properly manic, he was the person having to try and talk sense into me. He must have just thought, jeez, this is not what I signed up for, this guy. But yeah, I've had psychiatrists who I've really thought were not good. I remember I had a psychiatrist in Durban whose name, I would actually share with you if I can remember it, I just can't remember it. But I remember her saying to me, she gave me something called Brintalex, which was kind of a newer, at the time, antidepressant. And I took this and I was nauseous and I was throwing up every night for like 3 weeks. It was just horrific. And I eventually went and I looked at the symptoms online, and I went back to him and said, all the benefits that you said of this thing aren't really mentioned anywhere. And all of the side effects are the side effects that I've been experiencing. She says, well, real problem is that you shouldn't be looking up any of the medications that we're giving you. And so I was like, well, okay, I think I need to find a new psychiatrist. And I was doing my master's in research at the time, so I was kind of like, well, I think I should have some autonomy. And that's why when I mentioned that dialogue, it's so important. It shouldn't just be a case of you walking into a room and the person saying, I'm the expert, whatever. They are the experts on that sort of thing, but if they can't explain to you why you've been given the diagnosis, or why you're taking a particular medication, why they want to change things, then that's really worrying. It's just like, oh, I think I'd like to try you on this as some sort of guinea pig, then that's a problem. Because a lot of the people that I've met as well that have been diagnosed, I said, well, how was the diagnosis made? Because a lot of them are like, I don't know if I am actually bipolar. I said, well, you should be. Did your psychologist make it or a psychiatrist? No, it was my psychologist or psychiatrist. Well, go to them and say, what was the reasons that you made the diagnosis? And they kind of like, well, can I do that? I'm like, yes. If they can't tell you that, then find somebody else. That's the minimum that they should be able to do. If you're going to be expected to have this diagnosis, which is a chronic condition for the rest of your life, take medication, make all these changes, have a stigma, etc., then the least that they can do is give you a very clear indication of why the diagnosis was made. Yeah.
How do you get someone into get a second opinion or try another psychiatrist, should I say? Because although he had a psychiatrist, he doesn't want to be with him anymore. How do you get him to go to another psychiatrist? I mean, some people I know have gone through 6 psychiatrists to find the right person. How do you get like someone who's in that state to try somebody else?
Yes, so
I mean, what do you do to just try and
Maybe you need to get them to
So,
go in there in a neutral state.
the challenge that you're
No,
having, I
only
don't know if that's the same as the challenge of somebody in that state. Because what I would say is that a person that's bipolar, as we've kind of said, there's periods of mania, there's periods of depression, there's periods of euthymia. And as I was saying to you during the break, it's not so much about dealing with them when they're in, or dealing with us while we're in these states.
About in a neutral state.
I see it as like trying to cross a busy road, and like you've got these cars just kind of coming like that, and when that's happening, that's mania or depression, and there's not much that you can do. When you see a gap, then you've got to kind of go for it. And when a person's well, then to me they should be doing all of the things, and they should be willing to do all of the things. And if they're not, then it's a very difficult thing to sort out. I don't know if there are clinicians that might have better advice than that. And as I said right at the start, I felt quite lucky when I was diagnosed, because I was like, I thought that God had been talking to me for 3 months, like not audibly, but I felt like all this amazing stuff was going on. Then I was crazy depressed, and I hadn't really heard about bipolar disorder when I was diagnosed. Like in 2003, it wasn't as discussed as it is now. So when somebody said, this is the diagnosis, we kind of understand this, I grabbed it. I was like, great. They know something about this, maybe this means that I can be helped. But I know for other people, now they hear the diagnosis and they're like, oh, I've heard of it, and it's not good. So it might be more difficult for people to accept it.
Because he has studied it, he's read about it, he understands it, he's been to the day clinic, they've gone through a program, but he doesn't want to try another avenue. It's like a brick wall. It's hard. I mean, what do? You just have to be supportive.
Yeah.
And hope they'll get you.
And this is the trickiest thing, is it's almost like, I feel like saying, well, surely once a psychologist sort of sits down and works through the reasons that he's reluctant to do it, then that will be really great. But if you can't get the person to the psychologist or psychiatrist in the first place, then it's very difficult. Okay.
Thanks.
I don't know if there's anything else. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you.
Are you based in Joburg now?
Yeah, just off the Valley Road.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I could have walked here.
I thought you were still based in Natal.
No, yeah. I moved up 2019, so I'm at Varsity College in Sandton.
Okay. No, I was under the impression that we were doing it this Saturday because you were in Joburg for now. So, but with it being a long weekend, we actually missed on quite a few people that could have been here.
Yeah.
So,
I seem to time it quite badly. And in Durban, I ran it. It was actually quite well attended, but I know that there was a Springbok New Zealand game on at the time. So it was also, I think there's a game later. Yeah. So at least it's that, but it was actually while I was doing it, the game was on. It would seem to be, I think it probably would affect the number of people.
okay. Would you be open to doing it again at some point?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And if there's a way that it can be done, it can be more, I don't know, interactive or whatever, then that would be great.
Yeah. There are a few people within our parent body and our student body that would benefit.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do it. So.
okay, cool. Thank you. Yes, it's